To start, hi everyone and welcome to this session dedicated to behavior-driven development. So in the coming hour, we're going to see together how to kickstart your first BDD projects. So we're going to see some basics about BDD, but also how to scale this approach to a huge project and to large organization. We'll have a real life example and a customer case from Parkount. So a few words about the speakers. I'm Laurent, the product manager of ShipTest. I'm used to tweet and blog about testing in DevOps environment. So if you are interested in these topics, feel free to jump in the conversation and follow me. I will run this session together with Vincent. Vincent is part of the dev team at ShipTest, so you will have another point of view of BDD, one from the product manager, another one from the development team standpoint. And we also have the great pleasure to welcome Rafael Cito, who was delivery manager at Parkount on the huge ticketing system project that adopted BDD. And Rafael will share with us this very great experience. So this is the agenda of this webinar. I will first do a brief introduction about behavior-driven development, share some basics about BDD, but we will also have live examples, so creating scenario and features all together using some good design principles. We will also talk about the automation of the scenarios that we've created and how to integrate them with the CI, which is a second step and something important, especially if you want to do continuous deployment. And I would say the first step and value that you can get from BDD is the living documentation, the power of living documentation. And here again, I will share some example and practices. And to end up with, we'll have this customer case from Parkount scaling BDD across a very huge project. Before starting with the introduction of BDD, just a quick few words about ShipTest. So ShipTest is a continuous testing platform dedicated to Agile and DevOps teams. We are strong believers in behavior-driven development, and we are also practitioners because we use ourselves BDD in our own development process. And we have customers ranging from very small startups to bigger enterprises. So today, so far, we have more than 15 users of the platform in more than 100 countries. And interesting ratio here is that 40% of our community use behavior-driven development. So just a few words about a survey that we are conducting right now. So we are working on the state of BDD survey. We already had a lot of answer from the community. And after this webinar, tomorrow, you will receive an email with a wrap-up and also the recorded session from this webinar, but also the link to the survey that we are working on right now. So if you want to contribute to this survey and share your own practices of BDD, and if you want to be one of the first to get the feedback of the maturity of the market around BDD, feel free to answer the survey. Enough words now. Let's start by behavior-driven development. So what is BDD? And BDD is first and foremost about the conversation that should happen between all the project stakeholders, from the business users, the marketing, the developers, the testers. So all together discussing the feature to be developed, doing this before starting the development. And the idea behind is to create a shared understanding of the behavior of the feature. And then once we have this clear understanding and vision about the feature, it is time to start implementing the feature itself. So this is first what BDD is about. BDD is not about test automation framework, or is not about solutions like Cucumber, like SpecFlow, Jasmine, and I could mention dozens of other frameworks. These are good frameworks to automate the test, but test automation, or let's say the automation of the checks, the examples that you have created with behavior-driven development. So while you were capturing the discussions between the stakeholders, the automation of these checks is just an aspect of BDD. That's not the first thing you should start with, otherwise you will miss a big part of the value. So we start with this discussion. We capture the discussion using examples, and my favorite definition was given by Dan North. So using examples at different levels to create the shared understanding between all the different stakeholders and surface uncertainty to deliver software that matters. So stop wasting times to create features and develop features that doesn't meet the business needs. And let's start by first discussing all together what we should do, what's the right feature, the right software to develop, and then let's do it. So yeah, we will have the different, during these discussions, we will capture the different point of view coming from the business, the testers, and the developers. We capture this using examples, using scenarios. They will define the acceptance criteria for the feature. So we do this prior to starting the development. And the great thing is that the developers, when starting implementing the feature, they already have a very clear definition of the stop. When should I stop to work on the functional parameter of the feature? I will stop when I meet all the acceptance criteria and when all the examples that were defined previously passed. So it is like a kind of contract between the business and the development team. And the last point, which is very important, is when you automate this step, but once again, it's not the thing you should start with. When you automate the checks, these examples, then you will have a living documentation. So not only these examples are like the specification that you can use to drive the development, but they also can be used as the documentation of your system, and they are always up to date. The reason is they are the acceptance tests that are automated, so you know when they are when they failed, when they passed. So it's always up to date. So this is what BDD is about. Is it testing? What's the difference between BDD and testing? Well, that's so a question that we often face, and this is clearly two different approaches. So behavior-driven development will contribute to testing. It will help you to develop the right thing, but it will not necessarily help you to develop the thing right. So, of course, you should use BDD to drive the development from clear acceptance criteria that were defined with the business. But in order to have a good code and a good design, you should use other approaches like TDD, test-driven development, and create a lot of unit tests and integration tests to ensure the quality of your feature and of your application. So BDD is not necessarily about the quality of the application itself. It's just here to make sure that you have an efficient development process from the definition of the business need to the implementation of this business need. So that's, yeah, two different things. So let's see now, as I mentioned earlier, a real example. So first I will share with you our own experience, and then Vincent will show you a quick demo. So this example is coming from our community. As a product manager, I always have many users or companies that ask for new features, and one of them was I would like to integrate IPTest with my LDAP. So for those of you who are not yet familiar with LDAP, this is an Active Directory that is used by usually huge companies to manage admin rights and authentications for all the thousands of employees, and to manage authentications with different tools, like, for example, IPTest. So we had a couple of requests around LDAP. So the first thing that I did during a grooming session before starting developing the feature was asking the development team, okay, we have this request. According to you, just before starting the discussion, how many feature should we have? Do you think we have for this feature, and how many scenarios? So the answer was one feature and between 2 to 4 scenarios. Well, at the end of the discussion, so between myself, the marketing, the developers and testers, we ended up with 2 features. So we have to log in, we have to enable login with LDAP, but also manage invites within IPTest to invite other users that are configured in the LDAP. So not 1 but 2 features, and we also ended up with 8 scenarios instead of 3. So if we don't have the discussions all together before starting the development, you can be sure that we will waste 2 weeks to develop the wrong thing, and then we will have to check this with the customers and see what's the difference between what we've done and what the expectations were, and start again the work. In this case, we were able, based on the examples, before investing a penny in the development, we were able to share these examples with the customers and make sure that we were about to start developing the right thing. So this is why this kind of discussion is very important before starting development. Now we're going to see another example. So using a small coffee machine project that Vincent will present us. And during this demo, we'll see a couple of good practices now when it comes to write your features and write your scenarios. So Vincent, that's up to you.
Okay, thanks, Laurent. Sorry. Just before presenting the demo, I'm just going to show briefly the system I'm going to test with the BDD method. So it's a simple coffee machine, not really the really simple coffee machine you may have at home, more the automated espresso coffee machine that makes really, really good coffee, but complains half of the time that it's missing beans or water, or you need to descale it and things like that. So in this project, we've used the BDD method to describe all the use case we can have with this kind of coffee machine. So first important thing, of course, is to describe all the features provided by the system you want to develop or test. So of course, for example, for a coffee machine, the one we can expect is serving coffee, but there is also other ones. An important thing when you describe your feature is to show directly the benefits of this feature. I mean, whom it's intended to and what's the benefit the users will get from it. Basically, it's used with the keywords in order to describe the benefits and as to define the role of the the person who will benefit the feature. So, of course, all the features we have use this kind of annotation to really explain whom the feature is intended to. Of course, a feature can be refined in multiple sub-features when needed, just to help clarify those sub-use cases. And inside a feature, you will have one or more scenario to describe it and refine the use case. So, for example, there is really simple ones, like this one, serving coffee. We don't need 1,000 scenarios to describe it. Let's have a look at the scenario and see a few important things. First thing you may notice here is that we use a declarative style when it comes to writing the scenarios. What I mean by declarative style is I show the intent of the steps, what is done, and not how it's done. For example, we'll say, given the coffee machine is started, we won't say something like, given I plug the coffee machine to the wall and I turn the switch, the on-off button on, and things like that. The idea is to have declarative sentence that really explain what is done and what is the context of the test. About the context and what is done, by the way, one really nice way to write the test is to use the annotation that were introduced by Gherkin, which are given when done, which really clarify the intent of the test and structure that, the scenarios, sorry, and structure them. So the given part will describe the context of the test. The when part will describe the actions that are performed during the scenario, and the then part will describe what is expected from the system that we describe. Another thing we like to use in the team is the use of the should verb, which really explain easily. Every time we see a step containing the should verb, it means that it's a check performed on the system. That's pretty easy to recognize them from the actions that are performed or the step that describe the context. Just to show you how it works when creating a new feature. So one new feature about this coffee machine is the possibility to alert the user about maintenance, because as I said, it's a coffee machine that complains most of the time. So for example, we got four use cases that we described. So the first one about changing the water filter to remove all the bad things in the water. Second one about the same ID. Another one to say that we need to clean the coffee grinder. And the last one saying that we need to descale the coffee machine pretty often. If we have a look, for example, at the first scenario, once again, it's using the given when then syntax as all the scenario and a declarative style. What I'm going to do right now is write the second scenario, so which explain one use case, which is, of course, I don't want to get notification about the fact that I need to change the water filter if I didn't install one on my coffee machine. So, of course, we'll need some setup. So the fact that the coffee machine is started, and the fact that I didn't install a water filter. So after 1,000 coffee, as it was described in the previous scenario, so when I take a lot of coffee, which may be way too much, what you may see when I'm writing this scenario is that I'm reusing existing steps from the previous scenario. And that's really something that is important when you are writing your scenarios, to always get the same business terminology and don't end up with 10 ways to say the same thing. Of course, for the coffee machine, it's not a problem. A classical problem is about websites, for example, where you can have tests that says, given the user is logged in, given I sign in, given I'm signed in as this user, and things like that, and that you really end up with loads of ways to say the same thing. but in different ways. And it's really important when you start writing your scenarios and to always keep the same business terminology. This way, you'll see it's easier also when it comes to automate the test and things like that. I'm just going to finish writing my scenario. Just saying that we should just have a message that says that the no error is displayed about the coffee machine. One important thing too, when I was saying reuse the same steps across different scenarios, it's really important when you have the possibility to have a tool that allows you to do refactoring. So what I mean by refactoring, it's more a developer term most of the time, but it's the idea to update all your scenarios because you want to change something. For example, if I get back to the example of here of taking loads of coffee, I could decide that instead of using coffee, I could say, okay, I'll just take, I don't know, espresso, or I'm going to take long coffees or things like that. And what is really needed is the possibility to update all the scenarios at once when I does this kind of changes. Because of course, when it comes to having, I don't know, thousands of different scenarios, you don't want to update all of them manually. So it's really important to have a tool that allows you to refactor continuously your tests and maintain them easily. One last thing before giving the wall back to Laurent. As he already mentioned, for lots of people, BDD is the same thing than automation, and in fact, that's not true. Of course, you can automate your BDD tests, but you can also use the BDD scenarios to do some manual execution, which can be pretty interesting too. For example, let's say we started the sprint number 12 on our coffee machine. I'm just going to run one test because I'm not sure you're going to be really interested by me clicking 1,000 times on the get a coffee button. So I'll take really the simplest one. But as you can see, yeah, the tests written with BDD can be also manually executed, and it has the same interest, well, not the same interest, but also it really helps when it comes to manual testing because it makes the test clearer and other example. So I'm just going to run this one, which is a pretty simple one because I just start a coffee machine, get a coffee, and that makes me pretty happy. And yeah, so with your manual testing on the when it comes to BDD, you can also do manual testing that will help you to complete, for example, the tests that you haven't automated yet.
Okay, so if we go back to the, the presentation, the first thing that we should keep in mind when working on the features and the scenarios, the different example, is focus on the benefits. I could share also multiple examples where focusing the discussion on the benefits, what is the real benefits of this feature, completely change the way we have designed our examples and the way we have developed the feature itself. So when Vincent mentioned Gherkin syntax and the good way to write the feature as a role, I do an actions in order to get the benefits. It's not just about the syntax. It should be a mindset. So really think about the benefits and the impact that the feature will have on the product. When writing the scenarios, clearly keep the declarative style. We don't care about the implementation details. We don't care about the GUI at this point. When I discuss with the marketing and the business users and also the developers, what I want to capture is the behavior of the feature and not the way this feature will be implemented. So let's keep high level and using the declarative style. And I think the one of the also a key point that Vincent mentioned during this very small example is the use of consistent business terminology. So keep reusing the same steps from one scenario to another, and let's review and refactor them continuously. When we say consistent business terminology, we don't start the project with all the right steps or all the right business terminology in mind. This is something that we build progressively, and this is something that changes day after day, and as we add and write more scenarios, we need to change some existing steps to make them more meaningful and to reuse them in new scenarios. So you definitely need to refactor your scenario continuously if you want to scale your BDD approach in a huge project, which is something that we'll see after with Raphael. So if you just have a simple coffee machine, even if we've seen that maybe the coffee machine is not that simple at the end of the day, but if it's just about testing a simple coffee machine, you don't really care about refactoring. But as your project grows and your product also grows and you add more and more scenarios, that's definitely a key feature. So what we've seen so far is that BDD can help the team to be really efficient to capture the behavior and then drive the development. We've seen that we can reuse the examples that we have defined as checks after the development, so we can make sure reusing the manual checks that the development met the requirements, the initial needs. But as I mentioned earlier, if you are a DevOps team like the hip test one, we do between 5 to 10 times 5 to 10 deployments a day in production. You need to automate these checks, so you need to automate these examples. So this is now what we'll see with Vincent, and we'll continue with the same demo and see how we can automate the checks.
Okay, so one thing to note when it comes to automation, it's definitely something which is linked, of course, to the framework you use for writing the scenarios, but also to automate them. So in that case, I'll be more specific about hip test and the way we do it at hip test, simply. So to explain briefly, we have an open source tool which is called hip test publisher, which will translate all the scenarios you have in hip test to one of those language, and the list is growing. So of course, when it comes to automate, what most people think are, well, automating a BDD project are the, let's say, BDD test automation tools, such as, of course, Cucumber, SpecFlow, Behave, Behat, which rely heavily on the feature files. So just to show you an example, it serves coffee. So of course here you recognize same principle than I shown before. So the benefits, the user, the feature is intended to, and the test. But one thing I wanted to mention is BDD can also be done with more classical test frameworks. I'll take, for example, JUnit, which is a Java framework, which is definitely not meant at the beginning to write given when then test, but the same principle can still work, as you can see here. So of course it's more less easy to read than a feature file, but the same so the same BDD test can be can be automated, so using a BDD dedicated framework, but also a more classical one. The last thing I wanted to say about that is the importance, once again I insist, of reusing the same steps when writing your test, because what the benefit will be is that if you reuse steps, when it comes to automate, all the steps you reuse are already done. So just to show in the scenario that I wrote during the previous demo, it was this one. Basically, this step was already automated, the third one and the fourth one too. And the only thing I had to do to get this scenario transformed to an automated test was to implement this new step that I added during when writing this scenario. So once again, do your best to keep consistent business terminology when it comes to write your scenarios.
Okay, so I'm going to take the wall back. So what was interesting in what you've seen here is that the same scenario that was an acceptance criteria of the feature. So it tells the scenario tells a story about the application itself. The same one can be seen and shared as just readable text. So it can be understood by the marketing, by the product owners, the business users, and the same one can be then consumed by the developers for the automation. So make sure that every scenarios, every examples, tell a story about your application. The second good practice is the refactoring I mentioned, because the more you reuse the same steps, and the less you will have to automate. So instead of having I sign in to the application and I log in to the application, if I have I reuse the same consistent business terminology, I will just have one step to automate instead of two, and that will be much easier for the development team or the test automation engineers, depending on your own organization. It will be much easier to automate. And of course, this process should be integrated with your CI tool so that you can get really quick feedback and make sure you have no regression when working on new features and new scenarios. So you don't break existing examples that were defined previously and deploy in production. So these are the key takeaways. We'll have a webinar in the coming days dedicated to test automation. That's a very important part itself, an important aspect of BDD, but that's not the main one. So if you are interested in going one step further in the test automation practice and also the good practices when it comes to scale your test automation framework, do not hesitate to register to the next webinar. So now that will be the last point and the last aspect we'll discuss about BDD before sharing the example of Parkeon, so which is the living documentation. So we have defined examples and scenarios. We have automated these scenarios, and now what we have at the end of this process is living documentation. And I'm going to share with you the way we test active test and the value that we have from this living documentation. So basically, as a DevOps teams, we have, let's say, three main steps in our process. So first, as a product manager, I have to manage the different IDs and requests coming from our own vision or customers. And for each of these ID, we will define what's the feature behind, using the benefits first, and then who the features is intended to. We'll have the conversation, the discussion. So we will capture different use cases for this feature. We will work on the first prototype for this feature, deploy it quickly in production, and then we'll start to gather some data about the usage of this feature, about different activation points. So basically what we want to measure here is what's the impact of this new feature in the product, and what's the impact also for our users. So you remember we started the discussions at the ID level with the benefits in mind, what we want to do here, where we want to check at this level is, do we have the impact that we thought the feature would have at the beginning? Once we have checked that, then we can make the feature available to everyone in production. And at this time, we will start to monitor the performance, also the user experience, and many other aspects about the quality of the feature. But of course, first, we want to make sure that the feature delivers the value we thought it would deliver, and we want to make sure we deploy in production the right thing. So this is what we at TipTest the living documentation. It includes not only the description of the feature, the different examples given when then that use the Gherkin syntax, but on the top of that, we also had some metrics coming from the productions to have a clear view of what's the feature and what's the context of this feature in terms of performance, usage, activation points, and so on. And based on this data, we can have very meaningful discussions with the board, with the marketing, to discuss what are the next priority that we'll work on, because we already have a couple of data that we can use to make the right decision. So having this real-time view on the product itself, so you have the product, but you also have this living documentation with the context in terms of usage, definitely has completely transformed our whole engineering process. And what we have experienced as a software vendor can also be experienced when you are a much bigger company and on a much bigger project, which is what we're going to see now. So let's see BDD at scale on this huge ticketing system. So Raphael, thanks again for being part of this webinar, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say about this project.
Thank you, Laurent. So hello, everyone. I'm pleased to share with you some amazing experience about this project. So we are speaking about the ticketing system of Helsinki, capital of Finland. So the transport services combine metro, trams, buses, train and ferries. And the system manages about 1 million commuters per day. In terms of context, we have the prime contractor of this project, that is Tieto, and the overall partners as Parkeon are distributed over 6 countries from UK to India.
And I mentioned this at the beginning, but just a quick reminder. So Raphael, in this project, you were the delivery manager for Parkeon.
Yes, I was in charge of delivery, the software part of the program. So just to give a bit of background about the system itself, so it is built with 3 main components. We have a back office for the system configuration and monitoring. It processes all the transaction, events, and alarms, and so on, generated by the devices and the sales points. It is built using Node.js technology. We have a remote sales server that is a set of web services integrated directly by Tieto into sales points, using Node.js as well. And finally, there are some onboard and on-street devices that distribute, validate, or control transport tickets. It's about 6,000 devices connected real-time to the back office, and they are on Android. So now we have a small focus Parkeon Steam. This project means 8 teams distributed over 3 countries, France, UK, and Poland. So picking 3 different languages. And during this project, we had the equivalent at the VDS of the activity of 65 full-time engineers, including 15 testers.
So just a quick comment here. In the survey that so BDD, the state of BDD survey that we are working on, when we talk about the different pains that the team face when adopting BDD, one of them is the time zone. So you don't have the problem. You didn't have this problem during this project. But another one was the different languages, and you clearly had to overcome this challenge.
Yes. So here we can see the timing and the schedule of the project that lasted 4 years. You can see here that at the beginning there was an inception phase, and then specification, design, development, delivery, and integration. From 2K14, we switched to Agile and Agile method, and we used BDD to perform the design, development, and delivery. We had 2-week sprints for all the teams, and the delivery has been split in 3 groups of different functional scope, and that represent 50 milestones. So releases were provided to Tieto for integration in the global system at least once a month.
You mentioned 2 weeks iterations. You were using the Scrum process?
Kind of, because not all the teams were using Scrum, in fact.
Okay. So your own definition of Scrum.
Yes.
So why BDD in this project?
Great question. So why we choose BDD? In fact, at the beginning, we were looking for one delivery method that can be used and shared by all the team. And with this method, we wanted to be able to share a common business terminology. As I mentioned, there were teams speaking 3 different languages and that were using different technologies. So with BDD, we wanted to define this common business terminology, and that everyone in these 3 countries would be able to understand what we have to build. And the terminology was dedicated to this project. This is what you can build progressively when you use BDD and a solution like Test, for example. The other point that was really important, one of the biggest drivers for Parkeyon to use BDD was knowledge transfer. You may know that for this kind of huge project, you have the build phase, and at the end of the build phase, when the system is live, you have a maintenance phase. And if during this build phase we had 65 people working together during maintenance, it was only about something like 5 persons. So with a big mission to maintain, fix, and sometimes add new features.
And I imagine that these 5 persons working for the maintenance were not the same.
No,
that were involved
mainly
in the
not.
build phase.
Yeah.
So a big challenge.
Yes, with big pressure. It was very important for us at the end of the build phase to transfer not only the code, in fact, and the application, but also the business knowledge to the maintenance team. So the best way to do that is to transfer documentation, which is a living documentation, and the BDD scenarios that were used at the beginning of the project to define the behavior of the feature now act as a living documentation for a maintenance team.
Wow, you are pointing out one of the biggest benefits that you can get from BDD. This is what I mentioned earlier. When your scenarios, your acceptance criteria becomes the living documentation, so they are always up to date because they are automated, and you execute them after each build. And when these acceptance criteria can be understood by all the stakeholders, then you reach a new step in team collaboration and productivity, and being able to experience this at the scale of your project is just amazing.
Yeah, and wonderful. So now some key figures. So if we look at the functional test pyramid, so all those test cases were issued by BDD scenarios, and we had 200 end-to-end tests, almost 500 system tests, around 1,000 module tests, and in terms of unit tests, more than 1,600 scenarios. So altogether, it means that we have more than 3,000 BDD scenarios at different levels of the system. And the case thing here is that all these scenarios were designed using just using 1,700 steps.
So yes, that's still
it's big,
a big number of steps to implement. But when you look at the scale of this project and the fact that you had 3,000 scenarios, the number of steps is just really low. That's really incredible. And everything that we mentioned earlier regarding the good design of the scenarios, reusing the same consistent business terminology, doing continuously, refactoring continuously your scenarios, this is what you end up with. This kind of ratio between the number of steps you have to maintain, to automate, and the number of scenarios. So when using some of the good practices we mentioned, you definitely ease the maintenance job and also the test automation job. This is why we insisted a lot during the presentation and introduction of BDD and the small demo on these key aspects, because you can definitely see here the values of this. So next, Raphael, you have the tool stack, and maybe I would say the main or the most important thing is interesting in this case is the you test execution environment, because you use a tool stack that is pretty common when we look at the different teams using BDD in our community. So Jira to manage the features and the stories, Test to refine these stories into examples, Jenkins as a CI. But what's interesting here is the scale of your project, and the fact that when you execute end-to-end test, not only you have software, but you also have some hardware. So this is where it makes the things a bit tricky.
So the execution part in the tool stack is very specific to ticketing, and as you mentioned, we have to play with real devices and some smart cards. So we are using some fun stuff like Arduino and Robotium to drive an arm that moves smart cards in front of the devices to simulate a real person that is using his card.
So next time we want a picture and a video.
I can add it, yes. And in parallel, we are using Cucumber and some homemade tools to execute the tests. And everything plugged to Jenkins.
Okay.
So if we speak about budget, the cost of the testing in the global budget is really close to what we have in the project at Parkeon, the project that does not use BDD. So we have 16%, a part of 16% in the budget dedicated to testing. So it seems that BDD has not bring us extra cost, And moreover, we have an happy customer that was delivered on time with quality software.
Which is maybe the most important. And here again, when working on a small project, being on time and on budget is not pretty easy. It's always difficult. But when you also face the challenge of the scale and the number of teams you mentioned in different countries, the number of partners involved, that was an incredible achievement. One of the very interesting things I would like to highlight in this slide is the cost, because one of the points that we often see from managers when, as a team, you will say, I want to start or use BDDs. Okay, if we do a test first, if we use a test first approach, and if we start with testing, we won't be able to cut the test phase at the end of the project. So that will cost more. And what's interesting here is that when you compare your ratio and the cost breakdown of this project to others that were not using BDD, you have the same ratio. Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure that if you include not only the build phase, but also if you include the maintenance, then you will not spend more, but you will spend less because of everything you did using BDD.
Everything is in place, in fact. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So this is where I think behavior-driven development is also efficient. It's an efficient development process, but it's also efficient in terms of cost for small projects, but also at scale. So I think that's a good conclusion, Raphael. Thank you for sharing this great experience. And we are just on time, so we have 5 minutes to answer your questions, if any.
So I can see 2 questions. So how many bugs? I'm not sure I would say the numbers, but no, there is maybe something like a bit less than 2,000 bugs. But if you look at the volume of development of the system, it is not that much, and it's over more than 4 years development. And in entry, we have something like more than 1,000 requirements. So not detailed requirement from
very high level. So that means thousands and thousands of stories.
Yes, that's it. And there is much more internal bugs, but in fact, what we can see with BDD, we can see the difference between using other method is that we have less functional bugs, and we as Laurent mentioned, we do the right thing, and sometimes they are not working correctly at technical levels. That's the biggest difference.
So we have also 2 questions from Vivek. What do you mean by living documentation? So I will take this one, Raphael, and maybe the next one is for you. Was there requirements freeze or continuous update of the requirements? So what do we mean by living documentation? We have a couple of blog posts that describe this, and we're also working on an ebook to go one step further. But basically, when you have automated your examples, so your BDD scenarios, and both this, and you use them not only as automated checks, so acceptance criteria, but also as a documentation that a marketing guy can use to know if how does the system behave, how does the I don't know, search feature behave on the application. Can I use the tags or filter by tags and so on? If he can find the result in the acceptance criteria, so that's a real documentation, and because these acceptance criteria are executed after each build, this is what we mean by living documentation. You can have a Word documentation or specification of your application, but it will never be up to date because it's not used on a productive way, executable way, which is not the case with BDD when you automate the script. One thing that we add at TipTest in our own process, as I mentioned, is the metrics. So activation metrics, usage metrics, performance metrics, so that we have all the context of the feature, the definition, the executable checks, but also these metrics, and from a marketing standpoint that make a lot of sense. So other questions? So the second question for you, Raphael, did you have a requirement freeze phrase?
Yes, yes, we had a requirement freeze at the beginning of the project, but we address continuously a new change request, dozens of change requests per year, something like this. So the requirements change during the project.
So we have one of the question that is a bit technical from one existing IPTest user. So Vincent, maybe you can.
The question was, how do you manage the separation of IPTest from the build system, where IPTest stories can change without updating the generated test? To answer really quickly, the best would be to attend the first day webinar, which is dedicated to the automation. But to make it really short, basically when the CI process will kick in, the first thing it will do is fetch the definition from IPTest of the scenarios which generate the test, and not the action words, of course, and execute them. So basically there is no unsync. And I'll just keep another one. No, it's for.
So another one, which is from Jasper. How would you start to introduce BDD to a team already working on a project? So I think you will have maybe, Raphael, an interesting point of view, but I can also share some experience. A couple of our customers that started progressively to adopt BDD. Well, the interesting thing with this approach is that it's you can deploy it based on features. So you can say for this feature that we are going to work on for the next sprint. So you are on a grooming session. Let's start describing and refining this request or this feature, this user story, into a couple of acceptance criteria. And you need to have, during this discussion, the developers, testers, product owners, and maybe the marketing or business users, if any. So yeah, you can start with this progressively. The thing that is not that simple is the fact that BDD is also a cultural shift, a cultural mindset. If you guys are not used to communicate and maybe developers don't really want to discuss with product owners or testers, and you have this kind of silos, then that's a cultural issues that you will have to fix and work on before starting with BDD. So usually the biggest challenges are the cultural challenges. And sometimes you have additional challenges like the languages that you mentioned. But yeah, with BDD you can address this. You have sometimes the time zone, and there is no magic or simple solutions for this. But when all the team agrees to share and discuss all together, then that's a pretty good way to start. Is okay for a given sprint. And given features, let's start doing BDD. And you will have to experience the value of this and see progressively that because it delivers value, maybe it's worth spending time at the beginning of the sprint to have this discussion. Otherwise, that would be a waste of time. So we have many other questions. What we'll try to do, so maybe take a last question and try to answer all the other questions by email because we are running out of time. So the last questions I'm going to pick up is, during the project implementation, who led the sprint planning meeting? Was it the product team or the project management office?
In fact, both team led the sprint planning. It was a discussion between the project team and the project management. So we define what we pick some features that we want to be developed in the sprint, and it was both driven by the value defined by the project management and the technical need coming from the project team.
So it's always a discussions and a kind of negotiation
and
between.
It's very important to keep it as a discussion. In fact,
we can see the same. I mean the same discussions that we have internally between the product manager, myself, and the marketing team, not having always the same goals. Well, we have to agree at the beginning to pick up the right features and define the right scenario. So the value comes from the different point of views. If we are all testers, all product owners, or all developers, without any critical thinking, without discussions, there will be no value from this upfront meeting. So this is where the value comes from, definitely. Okay, so we've run out of time. I would really like to thank all of you for your time, for your questions, and these great discussions. Also, would like to give a big thank to Raphael for being part of this webinar and sharing his experience. And once again, we'll try to answer all the other questions by email. You will receive by tomorrow an email with the recorded session. So if you want to share it with your team, feel free to do so. And you will also be invited to another webinar dedicated to test automation. Thanks. Thanks again. Have a great day to all of you, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.